The glass wall of his office turned the afternoon light into something cold, and Paxton Grayson didn't bother glancing up from the tablet in his hand as he ended 11 years of my career in a single sentence. "Your roles are cancelled, effective immediately," he said, swiping through his investment portfolio like brushing away a crumb. Then, still barely lifting his gaze, "Surrender the system data, all of it." I held the folder against my chest and smiled, because I'd learned long ago that calm is the one thing a man like Paxton can never counterfeit. "I'm afraid I cannot," I said. "It's not yours to own." That's what made him look up. Something flickered behind his expensive composure. Not rage yet, just the first hairline crack in a man who had never once been told no by someone he'd already written off as finished. He set the tablet down with the slow deliberateness of someone used to silence following him into every room. "Welcome to the payback office, where the people written off in a single sentence usually turn out to be the ones holding the whole building up. If watching competence outlast arrogance is the kind of thing worth sticking around for, subscribing is the easiest way to keep these stories coming. We'll get to that glass office and the moment it stopped being his. But first, it helps to know who was standing on the other side of that desk. My name is Piper Hollies, and at the time I was Director of Calibration Architecture at Cygnus Quantum Systems. That title sounds polished and corporate, and I suppose by then it was. But I didn't come from polished. I grew up in a town in eastern Tennessee small enough that the diner and the hardware store shared a parking lot, and my father spent 31 years fixing other people's farm equipment in a tin-roofed shop that baked in July and froze in January. People hear that and assume I'm telling them we were poor. We weren't, not exactly. We had enough. What I'm telling them is something else. That I grew up watching a man kneel in the mud beside a stranger's broken tractor and treat that machine, and that stranger, with more dignity than most boardrooms ever manage. My father never once acted like the unglamorous work was beneath him. He understood the person whose livelihood depended on that engine was scared and tired and counting on him. He fixed the machine, but mostly he studied the person. That's the only inheritance I ever cared about. I came up understanding that the people doing the invisible load-bearing work are usually the ones nobody bothers to thank, and that empathy isn't softness. It's just paying attention to who's actually carrying the weight. I carried weight at Cygnus. We built quantum processors, and the dirty secret of that entire industry is that the hardware is the easy part to brag about and the impossible part to actually use. A quantum processor without calibration is a very expensive box of noise. The qubits drift. They lose coherence in fractions of a second. They lie to you constantly. The thing that turns that chaos into something a customer can actually run a workload on is the calibration architecture, the layered system of error correction models, drift compensation, and provenance logging that I'd spent the better part of a decade building from nothing. When I joined Cygnus, it was 9 people in a leased lab space outside Austin running on Paxton's pitch deck and a single prototype that worked maybe one morning in 3. I was employee number 6. I built the first calibration pipeline on a borrowed workstation, alone, over a winter where I slept more nights on the lab couch than in my own apartment. By the time the office had glass walls, that pipeline was the reason customers paid us. National labs ran on it. A pharmaceutical consortium ran their molecular simulations on it. A defense research group ran on it under a contract so carefully worded it took our lawyers 4 months to sign. The hardware got the magazine covers. My architecture got the renewals. Paxton knew that. He just never said it out loud because saying it would have meant admitting the most valuable thing his company owned had been built by someone who still drove an 8-year-old sedan and ate lunch with the junior engineers. I should be fair to Paxton because the truth is more useful than the grudge. He wasn't stupid. He was magnetic the way founders sometimes are. He could walk into a room of skeptical investors and walk out with their money and their gratitude. He'd built something real, and for years I respected the hunger in him, even when I didn't like the man. The trouble was that somewhere along the way, the company stopped being the thing he wanted and became the thing he wanted to sell. He started talking about valuation the way other people talk about the weather, constantly and without warmth. He measured every decision against one question. Does this make the exit bigger? People were head count. Customers were logos on a slide. And the calibration architecture, my 11 years, was to him an asset on a balance sheet, a line item he could package and trade. I might never have collided with him over it if not for the deal. In the spring, Northbridge came calling. Northbridge is one of those enormous sprawling technology firms that buys promising companies the way some people buy lottery tickets by the fistful, hoping one pays off. They wanted Cygnus, or more precisely they wanted what Cygnus could do, and Paxton had been chasing exactly this for years. The number under discussion was the kind that ends arguments. On paper, it would have made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. There was only one problem, and it was a problem I'd created on purpose years earlier, when nobody was paying attention. The most advanced layers of the calibration architecture hadn't been built in isolation. The deepest, most valuable error correction models, the ones that made our processors usable for the hardest real-world workloads, had been developed jointly under a formal research collaboration with the Hartwell National Laboratory. It was a partnership I'd pushed for back when Paxton thought academic collaborations were a waste of engineering time. He'd signed the agreement because the lab brought funding and talent, and he'd signed it without reading past the first page. I read every page. More than that, I wrote half of them, sitting across a table from the lab's counsel for 4 months, insisting on language most founders would have called paranoid. The joint IP provisions. The data provenance requirements. The clause stating that any transfer, license, or sale of the jointly developed models required the lab's written consent and full disclosure of the encumbrance to any acquiring party. I didn't write those clauses to protect myself. I wrote them because I'd watched, at a previous company, a brilliant team's work get quietly sold out from under them, stripped of attribution, buried inside a product that erased every fingerprint. I promised myself I would never let the people doing the load-bearing work disappear like that again, so I built the protection into the foundation where it couldn't be casually undone, and then documented it so thoroughly that the documentation itself became a kind of bedrock. Every model trained jointly with Hartwell was tagged with its provenance. Every data lineage was logged. The access protocols, the consent requirements, the disclosure obligations, all of it lived in a system of records I maintained with the same patience my father brought to a stripped bolt quietly, consistently for years. Paxton had no idea. To him the calibration architecture was simply his, an undifferentiated asset he owned outright, free and clear, ready to hand to Northbridge in a clean transfer that would justify that argument-ending number. He was about to learn the difference between owning a thing and being entitled to it. The first I heard of the trouble was from Ren. Ren Cassallen was a junior engineer I'd mentored for 3 years, sharp and earnest and still young enough to believe good work spoke for itself. She found me in the lab on a Tuesday and her face had the particular tightness of someone who'd overheard something they weren't supposed to. "They're restructuring your team," she said quietly. "I saw the org chart in the shared drive before someone locked it. Your name isn't on it anymore." I kept my hand steady on the keyboard. "Whose name is at the top?" "Desmond Vance," she said like an apology. Vance was the new operations executive Paxton had brought in 6 months earlier. A man whose entire skill was making other people's work look like his own. "Piper, they took you off the architecture. They gave it to Vance." I thanked her and told her to go back to her bench and let none of this touch her, because she had a career ahead of her and I wouldn't let it become collateral. Then I sat for a long moment in the hum of the cooling systems and understood exactly what was happening. They were going to remove me, claim the architecture as clean company property, and hand it to Northbridge without ever telling anyone about Hartwell. I want to be honest about the moment because the temptation in a story like this is to pretend I was serene. I wasn't. There was a flush of heat up the back of my neck. The specific humiliation of learning your erasure from a kid who saw it on a drive before anyone got around to telling you to your face. But underneath the heat there was something steadier, and it had my father's voice in it. He used to say that when a job goes wrong, the worst thing you can do is start swinging. You stop. You look at the whole machine. You find the one part that's actually broken and you fix that, and you don't waste a single motion on the rest. So I didn't storm into Paxton's office. I didn't send a furious email. I didn't call a lawyer in a panic. Instead I went home, made a pot of coffee and spent the night doing the most boring, most devastating thing a person in my position can do. I organized my records. 11 years of provenance logs. The full text of the Hartwell collaboration agreement with the consent and disclosure clauses I'd written, highlighted and cross-referenced. The data lineage for every jointly developed model, showing in plain, timestamp detail exactly which parts of the architecture couldn't legally be transferred without the lab's written approval and full disclosure to Northbridge. Every internal message where Paxton or Vance had referred to the architecture as wholly owned. The signed agreement bearing Paxton's own signature beneath language he'd never read. I didn't alter anything. I didn't need to. The truth, properly documented, is a more patient weapon than any lie. I simply assembled it into a single, clean, undeniable package, the kind of record that doesn't argue because it doesn't have to. And then I waited because timing is its own form of mercy. There's a version of this where I detonate everything immediately, and in that version a lot of innocent people lose their jobs when the company implodes. Ren, the lab technicians, the whole team that had nothing to do with Paxton's greed. I didn't want that. My father never blew up a tractor to prove the owner had mistreated it. He fixed what was broken and let the truth of the repair speak. So I let Paxton come to me. Took 9 days. 9 days of being quietly walked out of meetings I'd run for years, of watching Vance present my architecture to leadership in a voice that made it sound like he'd dreamed it up himself, of pretending not to notice how conversations stopped when I entered the break room. I endured it the way you endure a long descent patiently with both hands on the wheel. On the 9th day the summons came. Paxton's assistant, a kind woman named June Okafor who always treated everyone with the same warmth regardless of title, sent me a calendar invite with no subject line. June caught my eye as I passed her desk on the way in, and there was something in her face, a flicker of warning maybe or apology. She knew. People in her position always know first. Which brings us back to where this began. The glass walls. The cold afternoon light. Paxton not. Looking up. Your roles are cancelled. Effective immediately. Surrender the system data, all of it. I'm afraid I cannot. It's not yours to own. He set the tablet down. For the first time in years I had his full attention. Excuse me, he laughed, the short, disbelieving laugh of a man who genuinely couldn't process the sentence he'd just heard. Piper, I'm going to say this slowly, because I think you're confused about the situation. You work for me. The architecture is company property. You will transfer every model, every dataset, every line of it to Desmond by end of day, or this stops being a polite conversation. I didn't raise my voice. My father never raised his. The core error correction models were developed jointly with Hartwell National Laboratory, I said. Under an agreement you signed. That agreement requires the lab's written consent for any transfer or sale, and it requires full disclosure of that encumbrance to any acquiring party. Which means the architecture cannot be handed to Desmond, and it certainly cannot be handed to Northbridge as clean, unencumbered IP. Because it isn't. And I'd imagine Northbridge's diligence team would be very interested to learn the difference. The room went very quiet. I watched the words land, watched him scroll backward through years of half-remembered signatures, watched the moment he realized he didn't actually know what he'd signed. That's the thing about men who never read past the first page. They spend their whole lives certain they own things they've only ever borrowed. Paxton recovered fast. I'll give him that. The smoothness came back over his face like water closing over a dropped stone. You're bluffing, he said, and even if there's some clause in there, clauses get renegotiated. The lab will sign whatever we put in front of them. That's not your concern anymore. You're done here. He stood then, pushing his chair back hard enough that it rolled and hit the credenza behind his desk with a dull thunk. The movement was meant to intimidate, to use his height and the expanse of his office to remind me how small my position had become. He walked to the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight beneath the custom suit jacket. Maybe they will sign, I agreed, staying seated, keeping my voice level. But they'll only sign if they're asked openly, with the encumbrance disclosed. And the moment it's disclosed, Northbridge knows the architecture isn't clean. They know a third party holds rights over the most valuable models in the deal. That changes the number, Paxton. Changes it a great deal. Deals like this are priced on certainty. You're about to introduce a very large uncertainty. He spun back toward me, and I saw his hand come out of his pocket, index finger extended like he was about to make a point to the board. But the gesture died halfway. He stopped himself, dropped his hand, recalculated. Then I'll restructure the transfer, so the lab's models are carved out. I opened the folder in my lap, pulled out a single page, the system architecture diagram, the one showing every dependency, every integration point, and set it on the edge of his desk. I didn't slide it toward him. I didn't need to perform. I simply placed it where he could see it if he chose to look. You can't carve them out, I said gently, almost kindly, because there was no joy in watching a man discover the floor under his feet had never been his. The Hartwell models aren't a separate module you can lift out. They're woven through the entire correction stack. The drift compensation depends on them. The provenance layer depends on them. I built it that way. He moved back to the desk, grabbed the diagram, held it up like he was searching for a lie in the lines and boxes. His eyes tracked across it, left to right, top to bottom, but I knew what he was seeing. Nothing. It was a map to a country he'd never visited, written in a language he'd never bothered to learn. He dropped it back on the desk, pressed both palms flat against the glass surface, leaned forward. Remove them and the architecture doesn't degrade. Stops working, I continued. You'd be selling Northbridge a very expensive box of noise. For a long moment he just stared at the diagram, then at me, then at the window, as though the answer might be hovering somewhere in the downtown skyline. His jaw worked silently. He picked up his tablet, set it down again, adjusted the collar of his shirt, though it didn't need adjusting. These were the movements of a man whose entire plan had just revealed itself to be built on sand, and who was discovering it alone, in front of the one person he had most wanted to erase. I hadn't built it that way to trap him. I'd built it that way because that was the right engineering, deeply integrated, mutually reinforcing, robust. But good engineering and good protection often turn out to be the same thing. And the foundation I poured 11 years ago to make the system work was the same foundation that now made it impossible to steal. Paxton stared at me, and I think it was the first time he'd ever truly seen me. Not the line item. Not the head count. The person who'd been holding up his building while he watched the valuation. What do you want? He said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a man reaching for his only remaining instinct, which was to find the price. And this is the part I'm proudest of, because there was a version of me, a younger and angrier version, that would have named a number, a title, a pound of flesh. My father's voice again. You don't fix a machine to make the owner grovel. You fix it because the work deserves to be done right. I don't want anything from you, I said. I want what I've always wanted, for the work to be honest. The lab needs to be told the truth and asked properly. Northbridge needs to know what they're actually buying. The people on my team who built this with me need their names on it. Do that and you'll have a real deal, a smaller one, an honest one. Or don't, and let it collapse under its own dishonesty and due diligence. That part is up to you. But I won't be the one who hands them a lie. I set the folder I'd been holding on his desk. Inside was the package, the agreement, the provenance logs, the data lineage, all of it organized and undeniable. This is everything, I said. I'm not threatening you with it. I'm giving it to you, so whatever you decide with your eyes open this time. I read past the first page. I always do. I stood then, smoothed my jacket and turned toward the door. Behind me I heard him pick up the folder, heard the papers rustle as he opened it. I didn't look back. My hand was on the door handle when his voice came again, smaller this time, the edge gone out of it. Piper. I stopped, didn't turn around, just waited. You're making a mistake, he said, but there was no conviction in it anymore. Just a man saying the words because they were the only ones he had left. No, I said quietly, still facing the door. I'm correcting one. Then I walked out, past June, who gave me the smallest nod, and back to the lab, where I sat down at my bench and finished documenting a calibration run as though it were any other Tuesday, because the work was still the work, and it still deserved to be done right. I didn't need to wonder what would happen next, because I'd already done the only thing within my control. I'd told the truth and built it on a foundation strong enough to hold. The collapse, when it came, didn't come from me. It came from Northbridge. Diligence teams are paid to be paranoid, and the good ones are very good. Northbridge sent a woman named Naomi Frost to lead the technical and legal review, and Naomi was the kind of professional who treats a data room the way a surgeon treats an open chest, slowly, thoroughly, missing nothing. I never spoke to her. I didn't have to, because when her team began pulling on the architecture's threads, they found exactly what I'd spent 11 years making sure anyone competent would find. Every model was tagged with its provenance. Every jointly developed component pointed in clean, time-stamped lineage straight back to the Hartwell collaboration. The agreement was right there in the company's own records, signed, with its consent and disclosure clauses intact. Dates, and she understood precisely what had nearly happened. That Cygnus had been days away from transferring encumbered IP to her employer as clean property, without disclosure. To a firm like Northbridge, that isn't an administrative matter. That's the difference between a partner and a liability. The board meeting where it fell apart happened on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't in the room, but June was stationed right outside, managing the coffee service and the closed-door calendar. And she told me later what she saw. Margaret Whitfield arrived first, 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio. She sat down on the table with the decisive sound of someone who'd made up her mind before she walked in. The other board members filed in one by one. Harrison Lowe, the venture partner who'd led the Series B. Dr. Sarah Kermani, the technical advisor. Alan Chu, the CFO who reported to the board. Last came Paxton, walking in like he still owned the room. But June said his tie was loose and there was sweat at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. The door closed. 15 minutes later voices started rising. Not shouting, board members rarely shout, but the kind of sharp, clipped tones that cut through solid oak. June heard Margaret's voice, cold and clear. You told us it was unencumbered. You told us for 6 months. Then Harrison's voice angrier. Do you have any idea what this makes us look like? An hour in, Richard Chen came out, walked past June without making eye contact, and returned 5 minutes later with a printed copy of the Hartwell Agreement he must have pulled from the legal files. She saw him show it to the board, saw him point to Paxton's signature at the bottom of page 12. 2 hours in, Paxton came out alone. His jacket was off. His tie was gone entirely. He went to the men's room, stayed there 10 minutes, came back, went back in. June said he looked like a man who'd just watched his own empire collapse in real time, and was trying to figure out which piece of rubble to stand on. When the meeting finally ended, Margaret came out first and asked June to schedule a follow-up with outside counsel for the next morning. The others filed out in silence. Paxton was last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back into the empty conference room, then walked down the hall toward his office with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders curved forward. June said it was the walk of a man who knew he was already gone. The deal didn't close at the argument-ending number. It didn't close at all, not in the form Paxton wanted. Northbridge withdrew the original offer, and the board, which had been told for months the exit was certain, finally started asking their own hard questions about why their most valuable asset had a third party's name woven through it that none of them had been briefed on, and about why the founder had moved to remove the one person who understood all of it right before the sale. A board can forgive a founder almost anything except making them look like fools in front of the firm that was about to make them rich. Margaret Whitfield, the board's longest-serving member, and the only one who'd ever bothered to learn my name, was the one who made the call. I heard about it later. She brought in outside counsel. Counsel found exactly what I'd documented, because I'd documented it for exactly this. And the board concluded, in the careful language such bodies use, that Paxton Grayson's judgment was no longer aligned with the interests of the company. He wasn't marched out. Men at his level rarely are. He was eased toward the door over a few quiet weeks, his title softened into something advisory and meaningless, his authority drained one signature at a time until there was nothing left to sign. The man who had measured everything by the size of the exit was removed precisely because he'd nearly destroyed it. Desmond Vance was gone within the month. You can't build a career on standing in other people's light once the light gets pointed at you directly. And the architecture, my 11 years, the load-bearing thing, stayed exactly where it belonged. Whole. Honest. Properly attributed. The Hartwell collaboration was disclosed, the lab was asked properly and consented gladly, and a smaller, cleaner version of the Northbridge partnership eventually went through. The honest one I'd told Paxton was still possible. Worth less on paper. Worth infinitely more in every way that lasts. Margaret Whitfield asked to meet me about a week after Paxton's authority had quietly evaporated. We sat in the same glass office, though it didn't feel cold anymore, just bright. The board would like you to take over the architecture officially, she said. Title, compensation, a seat in the rooms where the decisions get made. You've effectively been running it for 11 years. We'd like to stop pretending otherwise. I thought about it longer than she expected. There was a time the offer would have felt like vindication, and there's nothing wrong with vindication. But I'd learned something in those 9 days of being walked out of my own meetings. And it was this. I had never needed the title to do the work, and I didn't want to do the work for the title now. I'll take it, I told her, on one condition. Ren Cassallen gets her name on the architecture, So does every engineer who built it with me. The provenance system tracks people, not just data. I want the record to show who actually carried this, all of them, and I want that to be permanent, the way the rest of the foundation is permanent. Margaret smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd spent a long career watching credit flow upward, and was quietly delighted to see it flow back down for once. Done, she said. I kept the job for 2 more years, and they were good years, the kind where the work and the recognition finally pointed in the same direction. Ren made senior engineer on her own merits and started mentoring juniors of her own. And I watched her treat the newest, most junior person on the team with the same dignity my father brought to a stranger's broken tractor. And I understood that the only inheritance worth anything had been passed along again. I still have my father's voice in my head. Stop. Look at the whole machine. Find the one part that's actually broken and fix that, and don't waste a single motion on the rest. I've come to believe that isn't just advice for engines. It's the whole quiet philosophy of how the overlooked outlast the arrogant, not by swinging, not by burning the building down, by understanding the machine more deeply than the people who think they own it, and by writing down the truth so plainly and so patiently that when the moment comes, you don't have to raise your voice at all. The documentation does the speaking. Paxton Grayson believed he owned the most valuable thing in his company. What he never understood was that you cannot own the thing you never bothered to understand. He thought the architecture was a line on a balance sheet. It was actually a foundation. And foundations belong to whoever poured them, not on paper, but in the only ledger that finally matters. The one that records who showed up, winter after winter, and did the load-bearing work no one else wanted to see. I updated my own resume not long after. The way you do when a chapter closes well rather than badly. And under my years at Cygnus I wrote one line, built the thing that held. It was enough. It was true. And the truth, properly documented, had turned out to be the only weapon I ever needed. If this story stayed with you, if the quiet ones holding the building up are the people you find yourself rooting for, subscribing is the simplest way to keep these coming. We're working our way towards 7,000 here, one honest story at a time, and getting there with you would mean a great deal. Tap subscribe, and let's reach it together.